Good evening and welcome to the Eclectic Radical. It's really good to be streaming again. As once more, I'm Chris Richards, the Eclectic Radical. And with me once again is my friend and colleague, journalist and activist, Alex Suarez. And he's here to give us an update on what's going on with the Alex Saab hearing right now before we get into the rest of the show.
Yeah, so I just want to let everybody know I'm wearing my Russian hat tonight, at least for the next few minutes until I get a little bit sweaty. And I'm wearing it out of solidarity with the ethnic Russian minority in Ukraine that have been persecuted these past 8 years, resulting in the intervention. But I'm sure we're going to be able to get into that in more detail later in the show. What I wanted to update the listeners on was what happened since the Alex Saab hearing last month, when I went down to Miami once again to be witness to that, and how the media, and one outlet actually quoted me, misrepresented what happened and how Alex Saab was defamed as a result. And with all the censorship and the imposition of one imperial narrative happening today, we see, so especially since the intervention in Ukraine, it shouldn't really surprise anyone. But here we have a man, Alex Saab, who through diplomacy was trying to defy U.S. sanctions. And now we have the United States that is doing everything possible to prevent a diplomatic solution in Ukraine. This lawlessness of the U.S. empire, it shows the desperation of an empire in its final days. But I wanted to go ahead into the Daniel Rivero article. Daniel Rivero is a journalist from Miami. He works for the NPR affiliate, and he was the only journalist, because other ones interviewed me and then they didn't put anything out. But he was the only one that actually quoted me. And of course, his article, although less biased than the others, was also full of lies against Alex Saab.
Of course.
And so I complained to him about it, so they corrected. And last I checked, they didn't correct it. I have his cell phone number. I texted him about it. I don't know if it's him, his editors. He hasn't reached out to me since. The last time he reached out to me was to get the quote for me after I left the hearing.
Sure.
And so his article, and it was up on Wikipedia, and then it was taken down. Wikipedia is also trying to only show one narrative about the Alex Saab case. But his article, it says, accused Venezuelan money launderer exposed as a U.S. court informant, court records say. Now, this is important. Some people might say this is just semantics, but it's important how this title and other references to him, being a mastermind of money laundering throughout the world, and statements like that Rivero had in his article. People have to understand how misleading that is, right? So there was originally 8 federal charges against Ambassador Saab. For those that are not familiar with his case or didn't see our show where I went into details on it, let me just get into the basics here. Back in June of 2020, during the Trump regime, a Venezuelan ambassador or diplomat named Alex Saab was en route to Iran to try to acquire humanitarian aid to defy U.S. sanctions that he has done prior. On the way to Iran, he tried to land to refuel in several North African countries who refused him. And something that was coordinated with the United States, with the vassal state of Cape Verde, up the coast of Africa, clearly, they diverted him to Cape Verde. As soon as his plane arrived in Cape Verde, they forced him physically from the plane and started torturing him physically and psychologically for several months. They held him. The African Union, the UN, they investigated. They said he needed to be released. They said that he was tortured. And then under the Biden regime, he was extradited in October last year to Miami on trumped-up charges. Now, again, out of 8 of the federal charges, 7 of them were dropped. And they say this was a deal with Cape Verde, but I think that's bullshit. 7 of them were dropped because there's absolutely no evidence. So the lesser charge of conspiring to do one account of money laundering is what remained. And because we have higher sentences than other countries, it's still up to 20 years. But the other charges would have been for even more.
Of course.
So this is the analogy I gave Mr. Rivero by text. I told him, I said, what your title of your article where you quote me, and he had a good quote for me. He didn't misquote me. I said I didn't believe that he's an informant, and we'll get into that. But the title of their saying that he's accused of having money laundered, and then saying he's a mastermind of money laundering throughout the world. I said this is the analogy that I gave. It's like the Spanish Inquisition is trying a man for conspiring to divorce his wife. Because under Franco, as well as under the Spanish Inquisition, because of strict Catholicism, that divorce was illegal, right? You know what happened? They went to live with their lovers. They were still separation. But let's say a man was trying to find a way to divorce his wife during the Spanish Inquisition, and the Spanish courts brought him during the Inquisition and charged him with trying to conspire to divorce his wife. It would be like a reporter at that time writing an article saying he had divorced his several wives throughout the world. So this is supposed to be the liberal NPR, who are publicly funded, a little less biased than the corporate media. But any legal expert could look at this, or any person with common sense. And by the way, in the article itself, it admitted it was only one account of conspiring to money launder. So anybody that has a basic understanding of law, I've taken a law course, but you don't have to take a law course to know this. Anybody has a basic understanding of law, even look at the article, that just destroyed Rivero's reputation. So if I was in Rivero's shoes, I would be pressuring the editors to change it because it makes him look bad. But yeah, it's like saying he was conspiring, with his many wives. He had not conspiring. It's like saying that he had divorced his many wives from all over the world. He was like Muslim or something and had many wives, when the case had to do with one account of conspiring to try to divorce your one wife.
Yeah.
So that's how bad it is. And again, that's the least of the bias of the other articles. I don't even want to get into those right now. But he put me in there. I had said other things he didn't put him in. Like I said, how you can torture a man that's cooperating, that's your informant, right? He didn't put that, because they never want to mention torture, of course. But he did put in that I said this would make sense that he would make a deal with the DEA where he gives himself up to the U.S. authorities. He would have stayed in Venezuela if he was an informant. He wouldn't have arranged for him to be extradited to the United States. That's what they're claiming.
Yeah.
And, this is the same people, that gave us that Saddam still had WMDs.
Of course.
And I say still, right, because he had them prior. Who gave them to him?
Us.
In order to fight the Iranians. And who turned a blind eye when he used it on his own people during the rebellions? It was us. We used it later on as an excuse because he was set up over Kuwait because we wanted better oil prices. And a lot of this has to do with oil, what's happening with Russia, what's happening with Venezuela. It all has to do with oil and also lithium, something that we found out recently.
And natural gas.
Right. Most of the lithium in Ukraine is in the east by those provinces that they're disputing.
Yep.
And the Bolivian coup, for example, against Evo Morales, that was about lithium because Bolivia has an abundance of lithium. So there's always ulterior motives.
They think Afghanistan may have the biggest lithium and gold reserves in the world.
Interesting.
And those are the two things you would need a lot of for electric cars: lithium for batteries and gold for wiring.
But anyways, before we get into Ukraine and Russia, I wanted to do my Russian accent real quick while I'm still wearing the hat.
Of course. It's not as good without the hat.
So I would say, my comrades and friends, I'm here to talk about the Russian point of view. And of course, I received the check yesterday from Moscow, from Mr. Putin. Yeah. No, but here's another one. Trotsky, he was spoke once in English, and this is pretty much what he said. He said, comrades and friends, Stalin's trial against me is based on modern inquisitorial methods. And it goes on from there. But Trotsky was much better speaking French and German. He had a very strong accent when he had to speak English. But yeah, so in all seriousness, this Ukraine thing, there is definitely ulterior motives. The lithium that's in abundance in the east, the oil.
Well, before we get started in Ukraine, I'm going to catch up the chat really quick. And then I'm going to say something about NPR that I can't help but say, and we'll go down on the first rabbit hole. But Where Pilgrim says, hey, we're glad you could join us. Frankie Lee says, hey, Chris, Alex. Hey, Frankie Lee, thanks for joining us. And since we're going to cut to Ukraine, and since we've been talking, feudalism is all about controlling the resources. That's absolutely right.
In feudal times, the farmers actually had more leisure time
Yes,
than they
that's
do
also true.
under modern capitalism in the United States. The
That's
feudal
true.
lords in Europe gave them more leisure time than what it is to work here.
So here's the thing. If we had modern medicine and, streaming, it would have been better living back then than now.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure people had a lot of boredom back then. I mean, the people that were literate could read a lot.
Now,
but yeah, there was no internet, there was no video games, there was none of that stuff.
You
They
said
do a lot of outdoor stuff, but probably
there wasn't a lot of literacy either, because the Catholic Church was really, really, really big on keeping control of the literacy.
Yeah, they didn't want anybody to understand the Bible, read it for themselves. They had to be the monopoly of the power when it came to reading the Bible, interpreting the Bible. Yeah.
Because the monopoly was what made the church powerful, is speaking for God, basically.
Yeah.
And that was the whole purpose and how they fit into that system. But I wanted to say something about NPR, because you said NPR is publicly funded.
Or at least it's partially, yeah.
And well, there's a tiny, tiny, tiny bit of public money. And almost every show has specific sponsorships, just the way that shows on commercial networks is. The difference is instead of doing a commercial for a product or a company, they give you and with additional funding and then they go through all the people who fund them. And sometimes, if it is a corporation, you'll actually see a little mini commercial for whichever corporation it is. But usually it's things like the Amundsen Foundation, the W.M. Keck Foundation, the Getty Foundation, the Pete Peterson Foundation, all these things. Now, what all these things are, with the exception of the Pete Peterson Foundation, which is actually a federally, an endowed think tank whose whole purpose is to lower taxes for the rich.
Mm-hmm.
But with them aside, most of these foundations are philanthropic trusts for the heirs of really rich people. Like the W.M. Keck Foundation is a philanthropic trust that exists to protect the money of all of the trust fund babies in the Keck family, whoever they may be. There are
Getty. They had a movie about the Gettys because the grandson was kidnapped in Italy. So that's a pretty known rich family as well, right?
Yes, they are, and they're also an oil family, which is important to understand. They made their money in oil, and also, and this is equally important, Gavin Newsom is essentially an adopted Getty. And his godparents are the Pelosi's. It's hard to keep it.
They're all connected, yeah.
Yeah, it's a big club, and we're not in it. But yeah, no, everything on NPR is funded by the rich people who own stock in the companies that advertise on commercial television.
Interesting.
There's a little bit of government money that they keep cutting, and a whole lot of private endowments. And of course, when something is privately endowed, it's owned by rich people.
What about PBS, though?
Same thing. If you watch PBS, it gives you the same thing after each show. And sometimes they'll actually do a commercial if it's something worth doing a commercial for.
Let me ask you, when Al Jazeera America, or whatever they called it, the Al Jazeera outlet that was in the U.S., like we saw in the censorship with RT America, when that was shut down, wasn't that around the time that Qatar was having diplomatic problems with the Saudis because they wouldn't go
part of it
with the Yemeni thing anymore? Yeah, so
around the same time.
So
they also had
working with the Saudis to silence Al Jazeera in the United States after that.
They had that big performance-enhancing drug story that they broke on the NFL, and specifically named names in the case of Peyton Manning. And a bunch of people said, no, this is BS. This isn't sourced well, and we're trying to cast doubt on the story.
Interesting.
In my personal opinion, it was probably a legit story, but it was being targeted because, Al Jazeera and not an American.
Right. They're Qatari based in the Middle East. What was I going to say?
But
Yeah.
that because they had made a big deal about all the hard hitting investigative
Oh
reporting.
yeah, I wanted to tell you something about the NFL. I think we talked about it before. What a lot of people wouldn't mention during the whole Colin Kaepernick scandal, for taking a knee during the national anthem as a way to protest, is that for, I believe, most of the history of the NFL, there was no national anthem. It wasn't until they made a deal with the U.S. Army, where they got a large donation, that they permitted the national anthem to take part with the NFL. So this was really hypocrisy.
Yeah,
they will say, "How dare Colin Kaepernick not be patriotic enough?" It's like these corporations based in the U.S., like the NFL, they're only patriotic when they're paid to be, pretty much.
Oh, yeah. Well, and remember, the NFL is another private club, and it's a private club for very, very rich billionaires. You have to be a billionaire to own an NFL team, but it's worth it because you make millions. And all of these folks are some of the richest people in the country. They're not the very richest, but they're some of the richest. They come from old families. The owner of the Jets, Woody Johnson, is the heir to the Johnson & Johnson fortune.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he's Robert Wood Johnson the fourth or the fifth or whatever.
Isn't there a Russian who owns a U.S. football team that was recently sanctioned?
I don't know about anybody in the NFL.
But it might have not been football then, but there was some who they're calling oligarch, right?
There is a
but
WNBA player who plays for a basketball team in Russia and was and Brittany Griner, who was having trouble getting out of Russia.
Yeah, she brought like weed or in the middle of Russia being engaged in a war. That wasn't very smart to fly there and do that.
Yeah, no, but yeah, it wasn't. But it is what it is. They were saying the oligarch she was working for should be trying to help her getting out, but he's not. But that's the main thing is that, she plays for that's the one thing I know of for sure is Brittany Griner plays for a Russian basketball team.
I think you said this on Twitter the other day, and I completely agree. You said, the mainstream media, the so-called mainstream media, is already doing enough criticism for Putin, right?
Yes.
We're not expressing support for Putin. We're just saying that the issue is more complex than how they say it. And it's not necessary for us to criticize Putin because they're doing all the criticism.
I will take a moment to take a shot at Putin just because I don't want this deleted.
With all the censorship,
But no, I mean, I certainly do not support the invasion of Ukraine by Putin. That is not something that I support in any way. I think war is terrible for the working class of every country involved with it. The people who get killed, whether they're in the military or or civilians, are usually ordinary people.
I would only defend war if it was civil war, where it's the fascists versus us.
Well, of course,
that's not the case because Ukraine's a different country. Although it should also be recognized, 40% of the population of Ukraine, used to be 50% when Crimea was part of it, are ethnic Russians, and the border changed for them with the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. But they've always been culturally Russian, right?
There's a lot of history there, and I want to get into some of that history because the American side of it and the Ukrainian side of it are very interesting. And the modern Ukrainian independence movement really starts just before World War II. And I want to talk about that some too. But before we get into all that, I want to finish saying Russia shouldn't be invading Ukraine. That's something. The issues that need to be solved are all things that people can talk about. Russia doesn't need to invade Ukraine to do this, or they shouldn't. The reason that the invasion is happening is because Ukraine says they don't want to talk to Russia about any of this stuff. Ukraine says they don't want to deal with the separatists. Ukraine says they don't want to honor certain agreements. And so,
like the Minsk agreement,
and they make people think that they don't have any other options. Now, In a perfect world, the Ukrainians and the Russians would be able to talk about this, and the U.S. would be doing what China is doing and offering to mediate and help and make sure things are fair. If they want to have that kind of mediation, they can do something where the U.S. can represent Ukraine and Russia can represent the separatist republics, and China can mediate for everybody.
It's also important to understand that Western Europe relies more on Russia than Russia relies on them. Russia's already just made a deal with Pakistan. They're going to start selling their oil to the east, to India, to China. So this is really suicidal, the position the EU is taking, going along with the United States on this. And prior to 2014, the Western-backed coup in Kiev, the EU was condemning these groups. Yes. They were condemning the right sector and all these fascist neo-Nazi groups.
In 2014, Newsweek ran a story saying that the Azov battalion was committing ISIS-style war crimes. Their words, the Newsweek writers' words, ISIS-style war crimes in Donbass.
The BBC made similar comments as well. So even the BBC was critical of these groups. But once they realized that the new regime in Kiev will rely on these groups to fight the ethnic Russians, then they gave them carte blanche. Or they pretended, like selective amnesia, they pretended not to remember all these condemnations.
But they were actually in 2014 and 2015. These Western media companies that are now saying Putin's Nazi and Ukraine is good, were telling the truth about the Ukrainian Nazis and comparing them to ISIS.
Wasn't there a senator recently who said this is like the siege of Leningrad? What that idiot doesn't realize is that Putin's parents survived barely, if you look at his family history, but they survived the Nazi siege of Leningrad. So this is very personal to Russians from Putin's generation, born in the early 1950s. These are literally the children of people. You know, they killed up to 30 million Soviets, including 2 million Soviet Jews. That's part of the 6 million figure.
Yes.
And guess what? Those Soviet Jews, you know where most of them were killed? In Ukraine, 1.6 million of them.
So that's
all the collaborators, and it wasn't just the Nazis doing it. It was the collaborators that they glorify now in Kiev that were responsible.
So this is some of what I wanted to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
The modern Ukrainian independence movement, not the first Ukrainian independence movement, but the modern Ukrainian independence movement started in 1929 with the foundation of an organization called literally the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, or OUN.
Yep, I heard about them.
The very first thing they did was not start fighting for independence from Poland, because what's now Ukraine was then Eastern Poland.
Yeah, Western Ukraine, Galicia, that area. Yeah.
Well, more than that, most of what's now Ukraine was either part of Russia or part of Poland before World War II, because after World War II, Poland was moved west. And so there's German territory was given to Poland, and Polish territory was given to Russia, and the effect was that Poland essentially was moved west.
Yeah, I believe that the region is called Danziger.
The region it was
the
Western
region that was Polish. I'm sorry, the region that was German that was given to the Poles in Eastern Germany.
Danzig. Well, Danzig is a
Danziger.
City.
I was thinking like Steve Danziger. Danziger is the region I was thinking of.
Danzig is the city. It's Gdansk now. It was
okay.
Danzig
They changed the name. Okay.
There are actually a bunch of cities in that part of Poland that had German names and now have Polish names. And the Germans were mostly moved to Germany, and Polish people from what's now Ukraine moved there.
I also found that recently Mariupol, everybody's talking about Mariupol now in Donetsk, that's under attack. And by the way, these are Russian areas. Why would Russians bomb their own people? This is probably in every case in those areas, Ukrainians doing it and fall flag and then blaming it on Russia. I mean, we've already found out even an apartment complex in Kiev that was bombed in the beginning, that was actually Ukrainians. They were forced to admit it, that it wasn't the Russians. So I'm very skeptical, especially when we're talking about Mariupol.
Well,
when I was studying Mariupol, the old name for Mariupol from like 1948, for like 20 years, was like a right-hand man of Stalin that was from that area. But yeah, names change, geographies change, and people just need to take the time to learn this stuff before they start acting like experts and start pushing these, CNN fake news talking points.
So when it started and they were trying to get independence from Poland, they didn't immediately start to fight the Poles. The first thing they did was they started killing all the liberal Democrats who wanted Ukrainian independence, who had started their own political party, which was the second biggest political party in Poland at the time.
Remember, that was also 11 years into the German occupation of Ukraine.
Well, this is still 1929.
Yeah, that's what I mean. From 1918 to 1929.
Well, the Germans were
actually from 1918 to farther than that. Because the agreement between Molotov, the agreement between not Molotov, this is before that. The agreement between Trotsky and the Germans.
Well,
at the end of World War I was that Ukraine would be in German hands.
And then they got chased out during the Russian Civil War. It was a long time.
Okay, that's good to know. But the point is that a lot of times they didn't focus on fighting the Germans that were still in Ukraine. And like you said, the Poles neither. Later on they did. Stepan Bandera, he killed 100,000 civilians.
So since you bring it up, I will talk about Ukraine during the Russian Civil War, because this is where the Ukrainian independence movement really started to move into its modern form, but it wasn't quite there yet.
By the way, we're talking about 1918 to 1923.
1919, yes. When the Russian Revolution happened and then the Russian Civil War started, Ukraine was still occupied by the Germans.
That's right.
But the Germans had also just lost World War I very shortly after that. And so when the Russian Civil War started, you still had some Germans in Kyiv. You had Ukrainian nationalists. You had two different sets of anarchists. The famous ones everybody remembers now, the Black Army under Nestor Makhno, and the Green Army, which had a bunch of different commanders in a bunch of different places, and mostly just tried to fight whoever came and messed with the peasants in that part of Ukraine. So they fought everybody on all sides and were just trying to protect peasants and nothing else.
Were they protecting the kulaks, the rich peasants, or?
No, they were protecting the peasants. There weren't, that's a whole nother thing that I have to get into. So there were not a lot of kulaks in the Tsarist period. The kulak was really a creation of the National Economic Plan under Lenin.
Yeah. That was actually, it's funny because Stalin opposed the NEP, which was a temporary measure. But Trotsky and Lenin backed it because they needed to be a little more developed before they could implement full socialism. They were waiting for the revolution from the developed society. They thought Germany, but that got crushed in, early 1920? Or was it early 1919 when they killed Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht?
That was in 1919.
Yeah, so by 1919, the revolutionary attempt in Germany post-Russian Revolution was crushed, and then the Germans pulled out of Ukraine. I believe it was in 1919. They were defeated by the Ukrainian nationalists. Okay,
and the Ukrainian nationalists declared the People's Republic of Ukraine, which was the original independent Ukrainian nation that didn't last very long.
And that was in 1929?
No, that was in 1919, 1920.
Okay, around that same time.
And then they were smashed almost immediately by Nestor Makhno's Black Army. And for a little while, Makhno was also the Red Army commander in Ukraine because they couldn't send someone there.
Interesting. And there were anarchists and Bolsheviks working together at certain levels.
And Makhno kept making deals with the Reds, with the Red Army, and the Red Army. Makhno was very good about keeping his deals with the Red Army, but the Red Army wasn't always good about keeping its deals with him.
Right.
And he was outlawed at least once and then asked back because they needed him to fight the White Army. And after he beat the White Army, he was outlawed again. And then there was a bunch of trying to make it right, and then Trotsky came and killed all the anarchists. That's the only one complaint I have about Trotsky, is that he did kill a bunch of anarchists in Ukraine there. But that aside,
well, he worked with them for a while. He even had differences with Lenin in the beginning.
Well, Makhno had several meetings with Lenin. They were not. Makhno was not hostile to the Bolsheviks as long as the Bolsheviks weren't hostile to him. He did believe that Ukraine. He did want to expand an anarchist revolution, and he thought he had an agreement with the Bolsheviks that Ukraine could be anarchist. That wasn't what the Bolsheviks wanted in the long run.
I mean, fast forward to the 1930s in Spain, there was socialists, Trotskyists, anarchists, all working together. During the Second Spanish Republic, they were crushed and replaced by the Popular Front, which is more of a Stalinist idea of working with the bourgeois, kind of center left Republicans.
The elected government, and they were. The Popular Front was led by communists, but included a lot of social democrats and liberals.
Yeah, because if you read George Orwell's How Much of Catalonia, which is a masterpiece about the time period based on his own experiences in Spain before he was known when he wrote that, you see that when he first came to Barcelona, that the working class had control there.
Yes,
and all of that was later reversed by Stalin, who went after viciously the POUM and its leaders.
Popular Front. It's important to understand
because they had a united front in the beginning. The Popular Front, which was
so this is where it gets complicated.
Was imposed on Spain. Yeah.
So this is where it gets complicated. The first part was that the Popular Front won the election, which was a big deal because that was the first time that the communists actually won an election somewhere. But they did it by seriously watering down their message. Prior to Spain, of course, the model for the communists was the German Communist Party, which was led by Ernst Thälmann, who was widely respected by international.
All the social democrats, social fascists. But it's interesting because, and that was because of Stalin's influence in great part. But it's interesting, in Spain they did the opposite. In Spain, they worked with the social democrats,
and this is why
in the Popular Front. Yeah,
Thälmann lost. Thälmann lost is the simplest way to put it. He couldn't win elections, and he couldn't actually get a revolution going in time to stop Hitler.
Mm-hmm.
So so Stalin's reaction to that was the Popular Front failed. I mean, the Thälmann plan failed.
Yeah.
So now we're going to try to do something with the liberals.
Okay, so they implemented that in Spain later because they saw that it failed in Germany.
Yes, and the Popular Front won the elections, declared the republic, threw out the king, did a bunch of good stuff, and then the war started.
And it's funny because the king didn't like Franco. The king had some sympathies with the Republican forces.
So this is where everything gets really interesting. So the king was not super political at that point, but there were two factions. There always had the liberals, who were the reason the Popular Front won, and a group called the Carlists. The Carlists were hardcore conservative monarchists who wanted the king to run everything.
But the Carlists wanted, even after Carlos died, they still called themselves Carlists. Yes. They were a certain type of monarchist, but they would work with leftists at some level. They were very complex.
They were, but they wanted to. But they were very conservative. They were very Catholic. And they were absolutely anti-republic. So when the republic was declared, the Carlists declared themselves loyal to the king and said that the republic was rebels. So initially you had the Carlists, who were fighting to overthrow the elected government, and the loyalists, who were fighting to protect the elected government. The loyalists won the first stage of the war.
This is before the nationalists came into play, where Franco
was before Franco invaded. This was the very beginning of the Spanish Civil War. The loyalists beat the Carlists everywhere but in Seville, where the Carlists were able to keep control of the city. Franco then came back from Spanish Morocco, where he was the military commander, to Seville, which was the only city the Carlists hadn't lost, and basically took over the counter-revolution himself, because he was
very opportunistic, because he didn't support the counter revolution at first. When he saw there was a foothold, there was a way to get in. Franco was very opportunistic in that sense, and then called himself the fascist to get fascist support.
Yes,
and all that.
And he did not support the king. When he took over, he put his own state into play. He did not put the king back in charge the way the Carlists wanted. And so the Carlists, who started the war, still lost the war. Because
by the way, you still can't criticize the Spanish monarchy. Currently, the great grandson of that king is the king of Spain, King Felipe or Philip. And there's a famous Catalan rapper who's also an independence supporter in Catalonia, in Barcelona area, who's now in prison. He's a political prisoner, and one of his charges, he didn't do anything violent, but one of his charges is criticizing the monarchy. But that's still an offense in Spain today.
Yes. During that period where the loyalists were in charge, the anarchists and Trotskyists had their own revolution in Catalonia, where they basically threw the Carlists out.
Them too, yeah.
And they threw the Carlists out. They took over the factories, threw the capitalists
Valencia.
out.
They had Valencia as well, not just Barcelona. They had the two regions there. Yeah.
Yeah. And then so what happened is the loyalists made the decision to retake Catalonia before fighting Franco. And so what happened is during the war, when they could have been fighting Franco, the loyalists were wasting time and energy invading Catalonia and killing anarchists and Trotskyists.
By the way, did the Carlists ever unite with the Phalangists and Primo de Rivera, or Primo de Rivera's son?
Well, so the Phalangists and the Carlists both ended up supporting Franco.
Just not at first, yeah.
And then Franco invaded because he had the army, and they had to support him if they wanted an army. And so a
lot of people don't know is there was international brigades in 2014. A lot of them in the name of anti-fascism, some of them being Spaniards.
Well, yes.
That went to Ukraine, to the east, to defend the ethnic Russians, because the Russian army wasn't in there to defend them at that time. And they saw in repeated history, the regime in Kiev as being a fascist regime, much like Franco's. Yes. And so there was international brigades that were set up at that time.
And because they were fighting Nazis. No, yeah. And let's talk about that, because this takes us back to... But so 1919, you have that short-lived Ukrainian Republic, the People's Republic of Ukraine. They were Ukrainian nationalists. They were right-wing. They were not quite Nazis. They didn't kill Poles or Russians, but they did have some nasty anti-Jewish pogroms. They really disliked Jews. That was a big part of that original.
And they repeat the same rhetoric today. They say that the Slavic race, which is supposed to be inferior to theirs, even though they're also Slavic and their language is Slavic, but they say that the Slavic race is run by the Jews.
So,
and a lot of that comes from the Bolsheviks having to have many leaders that were Jewish background as well.
Well, even
prior to that,
a lot of that was exaggerated too. But there was a very real conspiracy theory in Nazi circles, and as a result, in surviving Nazi circles connected to the CIA, there's the theory that they called Judeo-Bolshevism, which was that communism was a Jewish plot.
So by 1948, 47, with the formation of the CIA, they were using those conspiracy theories as well.
Yes. In 1929, the OUN was founded by veterans of the army of the Ukrainian People's Republic, nationalists. The founders were leaders who had been soldiers in the old organization, but they ended up being taken over by younger people with more energy,
including Stepan Bandera. He was one of the young leaders.
Became a big deal. Yes. But anyway, in 1929, the first thing they did, like I was saying again, was they started killing liberal Democrats who were agitating for peaceful independence. They didn't start killing Poles. They didn't even start killing Jews, though they did lots of that later. Yeah. They started by killing other Ukrainians who also wanted independence, but who were liberal Democrats instead, because they wanted the Ukrainian
a dictatorship,
independence movement to be under their control.
But they also wanted a dictatorship. Bandera did not support a democratic system. He wanted a dictatorship.
No, they didn't.
He didn't mind working with the Germans in the process either.
They wanted they had a very specific, basically, a republic in the purest term is a sort of fake democracy managed by an elite. The Roman Republic was deliberately set up to make the ordinary people feel like they had some sort of investment in politics.
So they could be pacified.
But it was mostly a game for the super elite of Rome.
And at times it was literal games to pacify the masses as well. Yeah. Right? The Circus Maximus, the gladiators, they would have some rich, Roman pay for the tickets and the free bread and wine for these people to go and watch the gladiator sports. And that would help make people feel satisfied because they have a little bit of say in politics. They
got these free games for free or at a good price,
right?
And they got to see the show.
But there was a proletariat that was aware and that supported populist leaders like Caesar and others that were later killed in the name of the Republic. Somebody that's written extensively on that, who's been a big influence on me, is not Howard Zinn, although he's a contemporary of Howard Zinn. Michael Parenti. Parenti wrote a great book in the early 2000s called Assassination of Julius Caesar, A People's History of Ancient Rome. And the word proletariat, which Marx used, is actually a Latin word, the proletiati. Yes. The proletiati were the people that they were working class, basically. They weren't quite middle class or in with the nobles.
The proletariat.
The suffering masses in Roman society that were trying to rise up.
They also called them the capiti censi, the head count, because they didn't count them in the census.
Oh, interesting.
They just sort of counted heads walking around the city and said, we think there are this many.
And there was times when the proletari that went to the gladiator games, would protest the treatment of the animals and the elephants and the torture, and they would be up in arms and upset about it. But often in Hollywood and movies like Gladiator, these members of the mob, as they're described, are shown as like these people that would show up and drunkenly enjoy the violence and have no brains and no capacity for rebellion. They have to have a strong leader rule over them. And that's not reality, because a lot of the proletariat were sophisticated people. They were capable of having empathy, capable of supporting populist leaders. And the populist leaders were later assassinated, including on in the Senate itself, like with Julius Caesar.
Let's be straight up. Mm-hmm. Even the Bolsheviks kind of had this idea that working class people were stupid and ignorant.
Well, the problem was there was such little literacy under Tsarism.
And that's a big part of it. And that's a big part of it. And
a lot of the Bolsheviks were working class, because how else would you get acquainted with Marxist literature?
Well,
but they were a lot of them were really fighting for the working class.
There were the intelligentsia, and there were also working class Bolsheviks. It's important to understand.
Well, yeah, that's true.
But people like Lenin and Trotsky were part of an elite. Were part of a.
They called themselves the vanguard. They didn't like to use the term.
They were part of what passed for an elite professional class in Tsarist Russia. That was why they had the capacity to be radicalized in the first place when most people weren't educated. They were educated because they were from that rather narrow class. And then they put that to use to try to widen that narrow class, is the best way to put it.
And also the working class were, a lot of them were former peasants.
Yeah,
went into the cities as Russia little by little became industrialized. But a lot of people say, there was more emphasis on the farmers and not the workers. Definitely. All you got to do is look at the hammer and sickle.
Yeah,
and they said that Trotsky came up with the idea actually for the hammer and sickle. But the hammer and sickle showed both the representation of the farmers and the workers who were, of course, in disregard and exploited under Tsarism.
So, but during those two periods, 1929, when they first formed and started killing the Ukrainian Liberal Democrats, and 1941 is when the second period started. We'll get to that in a moment. But from 1929 to about 1941, the OUNB first was killing off their political competition among Ukrainians.
Mm-hmm.
And then they were deliberately assassinating Polish politicians and carrying out pogroms against Poles and Jews.
Mm-hmm. And also ethnic Russians, right?
That came later, and the OUN started in remember what was then East Galicia, what's now Western Ukraine, what was part of the Second Polish Republic between the wars.
You know, Franco was born in Galicia, right?
Yeah, but Galicia,
Spain, the other one, that's in northern Spain. Yeah.
Yes. Well, remember, the Spanish ruled Austria when Charles V was king.
Yeah, the Habsburgs.
Yes, and so,
but the Bourbons took over later.
Yes,
they were descended from the French royals here.
Yes, it's all incestuous.
Well, yeah, I mean, all the grandchildren of Queen Victoria were the head of World War I, the Kaiser, the Tsar. They were all first cousins.
Have you seen pictures of George V and Nicholas II standing together?
Yeah, they definitely look alike, and they were related.
The only reason they don't look like twins is because George is shorter and fatter, and Nicholas is taller and more athletic. That's the only reason they don't look like twins. They're literally almost identical cousins from the Patty Duke show. But yeah, no. So
it comes to show the absurdity of monarchy, right? Because you're going to assume, because you're related, that you're going to have some familiar bond, and that was proven wrong. When the country's national interests didn't align, they would go along as heads of state with those wars.
Exactly. And so where was I? Okay, so
you're talking about 1929. Yeah.
Yes, 1929. So first they kill off their competition so that they are the only real independence movement. And then they start going after the Poles, assassinations, terrorism, all the stuff that we would associate with ISIS now. And from then,
by the way, ISIS has a history of being backed by the West too.
Yes,
not just these neo-Nazis in Ukraine.
And then, so in the 30s, after Hitler took over, there started to already be some communication. Because in 1929, when the OUN was founded, they deliberately founded themselves along the same lines as the Italian fascisti and the German Nazis.
And Hitler called himself somebody inspired by Mussolini.
Yes, they were inspired by Mussolini and Hitler. Yep. Hitler hadn't taken over yet.
Well, it's funny because the regime in Austria that Hitler took over was fascist. And they were calling for Mussolini's support in preventing a Nazi invasion of Austria because they were a different type of fascist. So there was different types of fascists.
There were the Austrian nationalists, and there were the Austrian Nazis.
Right.
And the Austrian
nationalists held themselves up to Mussolini, and even though they were enemies of the Nazis, and Mussolini is like, I'm not going to intervene. I'm having an alliance with Hitler. Yeah. But it's just ironic.
The Austrian nationalists wanted to align with Mussolini, and the Austrian Nazis supported Hitler and wanted Anschluss.
And that makes sense geographically, right? Because Austria is right between Germany and Italy as well.
Well, Austria itself is a German country.
No, I know, but then it united with Hungary for a while.
Yes, it was united with Hungary for a while because the Duke of Austria became King of Hungary. Very complicated and incestuous once again.
Well, there was two empires that fell after World War I ended. There was the Ottoman Empire, and there was the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and they both fell for the same reasons. They allied with the losing countries.
They were on the losing side, and
they were losing side. And at that time, Italy was on the other side. Italy was against Germany.
Italy was
World War I.
Italy was specifically fighting against Austria. There was specific territory Italy wanted to take from Austria.
Territorial dispute, yeah.
And anyway,
Because you had, what was it, Yugoslavia later? Because a lot of those lands, if you look at the geography, that's why it's important to understand geography for geopolitics.
All of that. So before World War
One, yeah.
Before World War I, the entire area that we think of as Eastern Europe was either part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire or part of the Russian Empire.
Right.
And the Russian Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire both fell during and after World War I.
Well, actually, that's a point. There was 3 empires, not 2, that
the
fell.
Germans,
the Bolsheviks took over, and they were against the imperialism of the Tsar, of course.
Well, yes, of course, but that came after. Before World War I, the Bolsheviks hadn't taken over yet.
No, what I said earlier was at the end of World War I, there was 2 empires that fell. That was incorrect. There was 3 because you also have to count the Russian.
That's true. Well, no, that's what I was doing. Yeah, the Russians fell too, and that was what I was saying is that in Eastern Europe, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Ukraine, Belarus, all of that stuff was either part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire or part of the Russian Empire.
That's right.
Both of which fell. And so all of that area was forming new countries between the 2 wars.
So Hungarian language is not Slavic. They actually say it's Persian in origin. But okay, well, Belarusian, though, and Ukrainian are Slavic languages. And it's funny because these Western Ukrainians, while speaking a language extremely similar to Russian, were saying that we're not Slavic.
Well,
we're superior.
So here's where this comes from. And this goes way back now. Russia is named after a group of people who called themselves the Rus.
Yeah, they were Scandinavians, right? Or Vikings.
The Rus were the word that was used at the time was Varangian.
Okay.
Which was basically meant Scandinavians, but the Varangians were specifically Scandinavians who had settled into the Byzantine Empire and become sort of integrated into its culture.
Interesting.
The Byzantine emperors had a Varangian guard, which was basically Vikings. The Vikings had a lot of contact with the Byzantine Empire.
Well, that also makes sense because look at the Greek Orthodox, right? So
a group of
Orthodox religion was the Byzantine religion.
Yes.
And it's also the Russian Orthodox is very similar.
Well, both the Russian Orthodox and the Ukrainian Orthodox churches broke off from the Greek Orthodox Church.
Well, the Western Ukrainians are Catholic. That's another thing. You have Catholicism versus Orthodox.
Well, that's the thing. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church is now in communion with the Roman Catholic Church rather than the other Orthodox churches. So it's really complicated stuff. I'm sure there are Catholics too. But Ukrainian Orthodox versus Roman Catholic was actually a big part of the Ukrainian versus Polish dispute. And they would burn Roman Catholic churches.
Well, yeah, the Polish are predominantly Catholic.
Yes. Well, that's the thing to remember. Orthodox Catholic and Roman Catholic are all Catholic. It's just they're different.
For example, like if you're a priest in the Orthodox Church, you can marry.
Oh, yes.
If you're a priest in the Catholic Church, you cannot.
No, well, again, the Orthodox churches are also the Orthodox Catholic churches.
Well, yeah, the word Catholic means
the
universal.
Roman Catholic Church.
Well, yeah, the word Catholic means universal.
Yes.
So it's supposed to apply to all Christian people, all Christendom. But obviously, the Orthodox in the Byzantine Empire, or what was originally called the Eastern Roman Empire, had differences with the West Roman.
Well, lots of differences, and on years and years and years, and more churches.
Latin as a language, they spoke Greek, just like they reject Ukrainian as a language in Eastern Ukraine. They speak Russian,
and that's a big part of it too. Anyway, okay, so they had relations with the Nazis even before World War II started.
Okay.
When World War II started, the Ukrainians were already in Eastern Poland in the part that was going to be Soviet under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. So what happened was they started immediately helping the Nazis and making trouble for the
There's
Russians.
something I don't understand, though. I want to ask you real quick, Chris.
Yes.
So, as part of that deal between Stalin and Hitler, they were recovered lands that was given to the Germans after World War One. You said that they lost most of those lands after the Civil War in Russia.
So here's the thing. They lost those land. Germany lost those lands, but Russia didn't get them all back. Some of it
all back. Okay.
Some of it was part of the USSR. Some of it was part of the Second Polish Republic. Remember, large parts of what is now Ukraine were part of the Second Polish Republic and not Ukraine or Russia. Whereas the rest of it was the Ukrainian Socialist Republic. So you had West Ukraine, which was part of Poland, and you had Central and Eastern Ukraine, which were the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic.
And by the way, all during this time, Crimea, if you told anybody Crimea was Ukraine, they would laugh at you. Crimea was Russian during all of that time. It only became part of Ukraine when Ukraine became a Soviet ally, and Khrushchev, whose parents were Ukrainian, gave them a little extra land as like a gift. Say, here, take Crimea. Crimea always had a fleet there that was Russian, always had Russian-speaking people there. And, there's people that don't know this basic history when they talk about annexation.
No. Before that, it was Turkish. The Russians took it from
they had the Tatars there. The Tatars are like Mongolian descent. They're descendants of Genghis Khan. You had the Tatars. You had the Turks, because the Turks are neighbors in the Black Sea that had control of Crimea. Then you have a lot of ethnic Russians there.
The way originally the population was mostly Tatar with some Turks.
Yeah.
And then there started to be more Russians there after the Russians took it. Politically, the Tartars had a Khan, but the Khan was a subject of the Ottoman Empire.
Didn't Stalin go after the Tartars as well?
It's very hard to keep everything Stalin did or didn't do straight because of
he persecuted a lot of people.
Well, no, it's beyond that. It's also because of the propaganda.
Well, yeah, I mean the what you would call it, not the plague,
the Holodomor.
Yeah, the Holodomor in Ukraine, but it was a famine. That's right, a famine.
It was a famine.
People try to say that Stalin intentionally made the famine worse, but I haven't really seen evidence of that. I think it was more negligence than intentionally trying to make it worse.
That was it's funny you should mention that, because that was specifically a propaganda story that was made up by the Ukrainian Nazis in order to drum up support against Stalin.
Okay.
If you had talked about the Holodomor the way people talk about it now in the 1950s, people would have looked at you like you were crazy. That was something that was specifically popularized during the later part of the Cold War.
Kind of a revisionist history, right?
Very revisionist. And again, it was part of the Nazi propaganda, which we're getting really close to now. We've already gotten to the start of World War II.
Well, what's happening right now in Europe? They're expelling students from universities just because they happen to have been born in Russia.
Yeah.
So it's not just a question of shutting down RT, shutting down Sputnik. I can't even find my RT International interview anymore on YouTube. But now they're just going after students because of their ethnicities. Just innocent foreign exchange students. Are they going to start doing that here? Because when they shut down RT in Europe, I said, well, at least they haven't done that in the U.S. Now they're doing that. What's next? Are they going to start pulling students out of my university because they happen to be Russian? This is Nazi-like this Russophobia that we're witnessing. Because what the foreign policy is of Putin, the Russians can't control their foreign policy. We can't control our foreign policy. So this type of hysteria, McCarthy type hysteria is just out of control.
It's ridiculous, but it's because we always make our enemies evil, and they all have to be evil. It can't just be that. It can't be that Putin is bad. Russians have to be bad.
And now we're going to get rid of Russian vodka. We know almost 10% of our oil now is cut off because we have to boycott Russian oil.
Stoli is changing their name.
And Europe, again, is acting in a suicidal way, not in their own interests. They're showing themselves as vassals of the United States. And I've been calling out for this a long time. I said, look at the UK. The UK, its courts, when it comes to the Assange case, is proving themselves basically being vassals of the United States. Now, when it comes to the British home foreign policy or the EU, they're also showing themselves vassals of the United States, going against their own interests. And now people are starting to pay attention to what's going on in Eastern Europe, but they're doing it based on a false narrative, false talking points.
The fact of the matter is, European foreign policy is not made by European nation states.
Made by NATO.
It's not made by the European Union. European foreign policy is made by NATO.
That's correct. And NATO is dominated by the United States.
NATO is dominated by the United States and the UK. And the UK's role in NATO is very much to suck up to the United States and bully everyone else.
Well, you've heard of the Atlantic Council?
Yes.
So the Atlantic Council is actually run by a British guy. I can't think of his name. George Galloway was talking about him the other day.
Mm-hmm.
This British guy who's in charge of censoring people on Facebook. I'm pretty sure the Atlantic Council censored me in 2020 from Facebook. I'm not welcome back. But the Atlantic Council is a lobby group for NATO. Yeah. And this foreign group that's run by a British guy tells Zuckerberg in their board meetings, censor this activist, censor that person. And it's like, and the censorship is now like that's something I've never seen before. It's insane. Colleagues of mine, I know Lee Camp and others. I met them in DC. They're all out of jobs now with the shutting down of RT America. Pulitzer Prize winning journalist Chris Hedges, who was thrown out of the New York Times for coming out against the Iraq War, has now been silenced. Jesse Ventura, the former independent governor of Minnesota, had a show on RT America.
Yes.
He's now been censored because of this, as well as his son Tyrell Ventura, who had a program on RT. Larry King's last job before he died. Larry King, who helped third parties, who helped Ross Perot get a voice. Larry King's last job was on RT. If he was alive today, he would have been out of a job as well.
Ed Schultz, who died in 2018.
Yeah, that's right. He was on NBC, and then he
had his Twitter profile, even though he's been dead since 2018. His Twitter profile was tagged Russian state affiliate media.
It's just ridiculous.
He's been dead. But yeah. I
thought you said that they took down his Twitter, but that's also ridiculous.
They tagged it Russian state-affiliated media when he's been dead for 4 years.
And so that's why it's on us, independent journalists, to speak out. We don't need to be critical of Putin. Our views on Putin are already known. There's plenty of criticism of him on the TV. I mean, I heard about senators calling for Putin's assassination.
Yes.
I mean, these are the same guys that were calling for Assange's assassination, calling for Snowden's assassination. They're just completely out of control. The censorship, the misrepresenting of court cases that I demonstrated at the beginning of the program. This is the new norm.
You have to censor anything that deviates from the official story if the official story is at least partially a lie. So, because if your official story is not actually 100% the truth, then you have to censor anything that contradicts it, because that's a danger of someone questioning enough and learning the truth.
And they deceive by omission. They don't mention that Alex Saab is a diplomat. They don't mention that he was tortured. They don't mention that the UN looked into it and confirmed his treatment at behest of the United States. They don't want to mention these details because it's going to make it look bad, the fact that they had kidnapped him and brought him here.
They're not censoring Putin but they're not censoring Russian state media because Russian state media is lying about everything. Though naturally their state media, they're going to have their own propaganda. Russia is not a communist country right now.
Well, I'll tell you this, the whole time that Lee Camp had his show for years, Redacted Tonight, he stated this, and I know it on his that he was never given any script from Putin,
and I've heard that,
and he was never silenced.
But RT America and RT in Russia are different things,
right? But the point is that they're trying to say, that they were given a script every week, and guess who gives scripts every week? The corporate media here in the United States.
Yeah, I know.
That's really the propaganda that I'm not saying RT's perfect, but I'm saying that there's blatant propaganda, and it's just one voice now being imposed, one totalitarian view on the European and the American people. And it's on us and the alternative media and independent journalists to speak out on this.
Oh, definitely. Absolutely. Where was I? Okay.
We're talking about the Ukrainian nationalists. And
we're trying to get into, I'm trying to get to World War II, and we keep getting sidetracked. But anyway, so when Germany invaded Poland, Stepan Bandera was smuggled from the western part of Poland, where he had been involved in rabble rousing, into the Soviet-occupied part of Poland, so that he could start making trouble for the Soviets when technically they were still Nazi allies. When Barbarossa started and they invaded Russia, two things happened. First, Ukrainian Nazis committed a series of horrible massacres in the city of Lviv. This is important because Lviv is now the place everybody's running to be safe in Ukraine.
It's one of the corridors, right?
It's in the west part of Ukraine now.
I mean, it's one of the civilian corridors that they've been negotiating on in Belarus to get them out.
But Lviv was a German and Polish city, Jewish and Polish city, almost 50% in 1941 when it was retaken by the OUN. And they immediately started killing Poles and Jews. And then Bandera.
Most Ukrainian Jews consider themselves Russian.
That wouldn't surprise me after World War II.
Right.
But Bandera then made his big mistake, which is he declared Ukraine independent, announced the Second Ukrainian Republic, and was immediately arrested by Hitler. Well, not Hitler personally, but immediately arrested by the Nazis.
Well, yeah, but he was released later on.
He was, but first he was locked up in Sachsenhausen concentration camp, not in the section with the Jews and the communists, but rather in the VIP section with people like the last president of France, the nationalist anti-Hitler chancellor of Austria, people like that. These were Bandera's cellmates. Bandera and his sidekick, Yaroslav Stetsko, who was locked up with him at the same time, would frequently have meetings with Nazi leaders despite being prisoners. Military intelligence people would come to talk to them about ideas for Ukraine. So even while they were prisoners, they were special prisoners with privileges who were talking to important people in the German military.
They're probably also told that they were there for their own protection.
Well, no, they were deliberately arrested. They knew they were arrested.
Well, what I'm saying is they were probably told that they were being held there for their own protection, but they were going to be released later on, and they were released later on.
They were released. They were released in 1944 when Germany was losing on the Eastern Front, and the German military intelligence just wanted to make as much trouble for Stalin as possible because they didn't think they could win on the Eastern Front unless they won on the Western Front first.
It's important for Americans to understand as well that I think I mentioned earlier, up to 30 million Soviets were killed by the Nazi invasion. That's more than any other nation. By the time D-Day came, the last push to throw the Nazis out, up to 90% of the Germans had already been defeated by the Soviets. So to make this comparison, that these people that suffered terrible sieges of Leningrad, Stalingrad, Moscow, etc., these people and their children, the current generation that are their politicians in Russia, to call them Nazis like the worst insult. In the United States, we had no land invasion by Germany. Our sacrifice was big, but it was not comparable to what the Soviets went through. So all these Hitler analogies, and they're giving these Hitler analogies while they're ignoring the fact that there's literal neo-Nazi people that follow this ideology and that glorify their collaborators like Bandera in Ukraine.
For the rest of the war, 1944, 1945, Bandera fought the communists as a Hitler ally. Now, what happened between 1941 and 1944 is that the OUNB, the wing of the OUN that was specifically loyal to Bandera, did the same thing that the OUN had done in 1929. The OUNB killed all the Ukrainian independence people who weren't, number one, Nazis, and number two, loyal to Bandera. One of the most successful and popular Ukrainian independence fighters of the time, who was not a member of the OUN, was called Taras Bulba Borovets after a character in a fictional novel from the Tsarist era, because he was considered such a hero. He was named after the protagonist of Taras Bulba by other Ukrainians. And he's a weird figure. He was sort of allied with the Germans. He kept issuing these orders saying he would not allow any of his soldiers to participate in massacres or pogroms, and then his soldiers would ignore it and do it anyway. And so it's all very... it's not like he was one of the good guys or anything like that.
Right.
But the OUNB attacked his headquarters and killed several of his lieutenants and captured his wife. He just barely managed to get away. And then they tortured his wife to death.
Oh, God.
And so this was the sort of thing they were doing to all their competition.
Yeah, they didn't believe in democracy. They were just cutthroat. They were cutthroat bandits, and they're glorified as heroes now for Ukrainian nationalism.
They murdered other Ukrainians who should be heroes.
Plus, if you're a nationalist, then why do you want a foreign power? Or you work with the power that's controlling your country, like the Germans?
Other nationalists,
right? That as well.
And so it was very ugly. But basically, what it meant is, by the time the war was over in 1945, the entire Ukrainian anti-Soviet independence movement was now the OUNB, the Nazis. The Nazis were now the Ukrainian.
And guess who protected Bandera? The Western, yes. The West German government.
In 1946, British intelligence and members of G2, it was then, Army intelligence, made a deal with a German who had run Hitler's spy network in Eastern Europe, named Reinhard Gehlen. And Gehlen formed, at the time, what was called the Gehlen Organization, which was a massive operation to spy on East Germany and the Russians in East Germany for the Western Allies. And to do this, he recruited lots of SS and Gestapo members. Even though Gehlen himself was Abwehr and not SS or Gestapo, he recruited a lot of SS and Gestapo people to work for him.
You're talking about former SS, former Gestapo, post-World War II that had remained in Germany.
Yes. And they were working for British and American military intelligence.
Of course. And one of the first operations that the CIA did, I believe it was the year after their formation in 48.
Yeah, Operation
was Paperclip, bringing them to NASA. But also, it wasn't just scientists. It was war criminals that they sent to South America.
Well, that was and there was Gladio, where people like the Ukrainians, the OUNB, were deliberately seeded back into places like Ukraine and Belarus.
I heard about Gladio. There was a woman who was a whistleblower who was gagged for a while, who's spoken about Gladio. That was also a CIA operation.
And so there were all these Nazi terrorist organizations in Eastern Europe that were committing these horrible crimes and blaming them on the communist governments.
False flags. We see that now.
Yeah. Yes.
And we also have done false flags. Look at Gulf of Tonkin. Yes. Because of the Pentagon paper in Ellsberg, we know that Vietnam was based on a lie as well.
And one of the first people that Gehlen saved was Stepan Bandera.
Yeah. And
Stepan Bandera founded his own group, the Bandera Organization, which operated out of Germany.
Munich, right?
Yes, Munich. That is right. And they had communications with their fellow Ukrainians in the Soviet Union through neutral Austria. The Ukrainians in the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, the UPA, which was still loyal to Bandera, fought the Russians in Ukraine until 1953, when they were finally defeated.
Were they defeated before Stalin's death in 53?
They were defeated before Stalin died, I think.
Okay.
Yes. But they were, if not very shortly thereafter. And Bandera himself, though he continued doing terrorist dirty work for the CIA and MI6, and by that time the West German BND, for a few more years, Bandera was murdered by the KGB in
1959.
Yes.
Yep.
And then from that point on, the people...
That was two great things that happened in 1959. You had the Cuban Revolution, and they finally caught up to Bandera.
And then after Bandera died, the guy in charge was his former sidekick from the concentration camp, Yaroslav Stetsko.
Yeah.
Now, what's important about Stetsko is that he stayed in Germany, and in 1946, where Bandera was doing cloak and dagger stuff, Stetsko was sort of stepping out into the sunlight and entering into a propaganda war with the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
Stetsko was the original chairman of what was called the Anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations.
Huh.
This was formed by the CIA, but it started out as a set of notes in a notebook by one of Hitler's lieutenants, a man named Alfred Rosenberg, who's the guy who wrote the Nuremberg laws and who was very big on writing propaganda against the Soviet Union and communism, and who invented, in many ways, the sort of modern idea of Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracies, where communism...
because his last name is similar to a Jewish surname. It's not, though. Yeah.
Yes. Well, Rosenberg is a German surname that can be Jewish or Christian.
Well, it can be spelled with a U or an E, right? I think if it's with the U, it's German.
It's spelled Alfred Rosenberg's name is spelled the same way as the famous Rosenbergs who were executed for giving the...
Yeah, they were Jewish American.
Yeah, they were Jewish American.
There was also Rosenbergs that were friends with Trotsky, but they were different Rosenbergs. Yeah.
Well, that's where the thing was, is that there were Christian Rosenbergs and Jewish Rosenbergs, and some of them were related to each other.
Interesting, because they converted. Yeah.
Well,
Germany, if you wanted to work as like a lawyer, for example, you converted to Christianity. Marx's family, Marx was Jewish background, but they had converted to Lutheranism so that the Marx's father could become a lawyer and all that.
Yes, exactly. And that was the sort of thing that happened in Germany. And if you had been Christian long enough, under the Nuremberg laws, you were Christian. But if you
the Jews were not considered a race for a long time.
If you tried to change your religion from Jewish to Christian after the Nazis took power, they assumed you were just becoming a Christian to save your neck.
Yeah, that's with the Nuremberg laws, the bad Nuremberg law, not the ones that came out of international law.
Well, that's the Nuremberg Code.
The Nuremberg race laws is what changed all of that. Right. I think if you were like a quarter Jewish, you were not considered Jewish.
It was based on...
If you were half Jewish, you would be considered Jewish, something like that.
It was based on how long your family had been Christian.
That too, right? Yeah.
And when the last person in your family married in who was Jewish and not Christian. And it was basically based on it was the same sort of system as the black codes in southern states that decided who was white, who was black, and who was mixed race.
It also reminds me a lot of the Spanish Inquisition, because a lot of the conversos, the Jews that did go in exile in Spain in 1492, but stayed behind and converted to Catholicism, a lot of them had to prove that they were maintaining Christian traditions and how Christian were they. And the first time that they referred to police as pigs was back then, 500 years ago, because they had a thing called La División del Puerco, which means the pork division of the Inquisition. And they would go to the homes of the conversos and make them
eat pork
to show that they were no longer... Yeah, because you had, people that were considered Moros or Moroccan that converted to Christianity, but in the mountains, they maintained their Muslim traditions. And you had something similar also with the Jews. So they had to prove that they were Catholic.
Oh, yes, and that's true. And so the largest group in the anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations was the Ukrainian OUNB. which was now just the OUN, of which Stetsko became the official leader in 1968. 9 years
so he
ago.
outlived Bandera then.
He outlived Bandera by a long bit. And during the anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations days, they had a lot of swing in the American political establishment.
Interesting.
We had what was called Captive Nations Week in the United States. It still goes on now, but it was a huge deal during the Cold War. They would have parades in New York.
During the last Cold War, right? Because we got our own one going on. Yeah. The third Cold War.
The second, Cold War II. Maybe
the third one, because think about it. The embargo against the Soviet Union at its inception, 1917, was instituted by the United States and other countries. And then actually there was a land invasion during the Civil War in 1918.
Yes.
And so you could say at that point it was kind of a Cold War as well.
Yeah, the British took Archangel and held it for most of the Civil War and didn't return it until after.
I like to think critically, so I read books I disagree with. So I read a book where the guy was proud the fact the United States was one of the invading armies in 1918, but he was admitting this stuff. And prior to this, I only read books written by socialists or left-leaning people that were complaining about how the U.S. was already in 1918 acting like an empire in Russia. But this guy wrote a book saying, "Look how cool it was that we did this." I thought that was funny. I think it was called "The Plot to Kill Lenin" or something. Name of the book, but it's all based on declassified real stuff.
This matters too. This ties together. So in 1917, the whole reason that Woodrow Wilson had entered World War I was because he wanted to have a say in the peace. Woodrow Wilson, of course, was the one who came up with the idea for the League of Nations, which was what became the idea for the United Nations later.
Yeah. The initial League of Nations failed, but the UN was more successful.
But the whole point of the League of Nations, as Woodrow Wilson conceived it, was to maintain the colonial order,
right?
To maintain white supremacy, to keep Europe in charge of the world.
This was after the Spanish-American War. The U.S. had colonies in the Philippines,
Puerto
Rico, part of Cuba. Yep.
They wanted to make a deal between all the European countries that would stop them from fighting amongst each other so that their colonies would be safe.
Right.
Woodrow Wilson wanted to maintain white control of the world.
Well, FDR was the opposite. With FDR, he made a deal with Churchill that after World War II, that the British would start leaving their colonies,
and India,
etc. But part of the reason why FDR wanted to do that, I'm not saying he's such a great guy. Part of the reason why he wanted to do that is because he wanted the U.S. to take over that imperial role that the British used to have.
The U.S. was going to take over Britain's job as the world's policeman, essentially.
Pretty much, yeah.
And by being the world's policeman, why was the UK the world's policeman? Because they were the most powerful empire in the world.
They had the most powerful navy. If you had a strong navy, that's part of the reason why Napoleon wasn't able to dominate the British, because he didn't have as powerful navy. Even though he had more ground forces.
His navy was his navy had already been mostly destroyed by the time he took over, and what was left of it was completely destroyed at Trafalgar.
Right.
But
that's why the British still occupy part of Spain in Gibraltar.
Yes, Gibraltar.
That was part of the deal, because when they kicked out the Napoleonic forces, they were given that land.
Even before that, the British have had Gibraltar since the War of the Spanish Succession, which is at the very beginning of the 18th century.
Right, because when the Napoleonic forces left in the early 1800s, Gibraltar was given to the British
Gibraltar was already British then. They took it from Spain in the War of the Spanish Succession.
Okay, so the War of the Spanish Succession was prior to when the Napoleonic
forces were thrown out? It was in the early 1700s, long before Napoleon was born. The Spanish Succession is how the Bourbons became the kings of Spain.
Okay.
Louis XIV fought all of Europe.
That's when it was transferred from the Habsburgs to the Bourbons.
Yes, Louis XIV.
But we can put it this way, though. There was calls for the British to leave Gibraltar.
Yes.
After Napoleonic forces were thrown out, and those calls were subdued. They said, "Look, the British helped us. They came through Portugal and they helped liberate Spain from the Napoleonic forces."
There have been calls to kick the British out of Gibraltar since Gibraltar was given to the British.
Yeah, Franco tried to do it. He
Yes.
tried to work with the British in Morocco and say, "Hey, can you guys leave Gibraltar?" But they
Yes.
haven't left it. It's kind of like the U.S. with Guantanamo. When Obama
Yes.
made the deal with Raul Castro,
Exactly.
the U.S. was adamant that they'd have to remain in Guantanamo.
Yeah, and that's the whole thing. We're the new naval power. That's why we have naval bases all over the world.
Yeah,
just like the British did. But so during this Cold War period, first Cold War, if you like, the anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations' job was to whip up anti-Soviet propaganda by talking a lot about how their people were oppressed by the Soviets. The problem is that all these members and leaders of the ABN could not help but say really Nazi things.
yeah.
To the point that when Nixon was running for president in 1968, a reporter interviewed some of these anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations people during Captive Nations Week, thinking, well, this will be some interesting color. And he walked away. Oh my God, these people are Nazis. And they helped choose Nixon as the Republican nominee.
Nixon loved Franco as well. Kennedy had diplomatic problems with Franco being more progressive, but Nixon embraced Franco and helped integrate him into Europe.
Both Nixon and Reagan, in part, won the nomination of the Republican Party because the national security wing of the Republican Party was in big with these anti-Soviet Nazis from Soviet republics.
And who was the Franco of South America? Was Pinochet. Pinochet was backed by Reagan, backed by Thatcher into the 1980s.
Put in power by Nixon.
What's that?
Put in power by Nixon.
Yes, put in power by Nixon originally in the early 70s. But when Pinochet had some problems, Thatcher protected him in exile in Britain. He lived like in a mansion in house arrest when Garzón was going after him. And of course, prior to that, Reagan was continuing his support for Pinochet, who was kind of the Franco of South America, you could say. Because Franco, if he wasn't a full fascist, he was at least fascist leaning. I've defined Pinochet in Chile as a neoliberal fascist. So he's a fascist with neoliberal characteristics.
Well, and Pinochet was copying Franco's contemporary in Portugal, who was also very much sort of a very neoliberal fascist who tried to run his country like a business in the way that Mussolini talked about fascism as corporatism.
Right. I'm looking up his name because he was allied with Franco in Portugal.
Well,
Salazar.
Salazar was neutral, but very close to the Allies, and but also close to Franco. It's very complicated. Yep. Salazar loved American business people and loved Wall Street and loved
American. There was American military bases placed in Spain by Franco. Some nationalist, right? He's going to rely on German.
He was
German and Italian support during the Civil War, and then take American bases in.
A fascist country, Franco's Spain, joined NATO while still a fascist country.
That's true. The European community that was fascist country. The European community that was forming, they rejected Franco because they consider him the last remnants of fascism in the continent. But NATO took him in because NATO was dominated by the United States, and NATO was and is an extremely reactionary organization.
The man in charge of the European, what was it? The European Union Commission. So before there was a European Union, there was a commission that was designed.
Yeah, the commission was the community that they were first forming.
Well, not even the community. It was the European Union Commission, which came even before the European community. Its chairman was a Nazi.
Well, the point is that Europe did not like Franco.
Well, no, I know. They wanted democracy.
The last remnant of fascism in the continent. But because of U.S. intervention, they were not able to remove Franco. And then Franco was able, before joining with any European group, to enter NATO.
Yes. And so anyway, Reagan Reagan and Nixon were partially nominated because of the influence of people like Yaroslav Stetsko and other anti-Soviet Nazis from places like Ukraine. And when Stetsko died, his widow, Slava, survived him by quite a few years. She went back to Ukraine in 1991, and Slava Stetsko co-founded the Congress of Ukrainian Nationalists.
Interesting.
Which is the official political arm of the old Banderaites, and see themselves as the OUN today.
It's all linked.
It's all linked. And there are scarier links too. Poroshenko, the first president to be elected after the 2014 coup. He was the
more pro-West one, you could say.
There was a temporary president for a little while, an interim president, and then the interim president stepped down after an election, and Poroshenko was the first president elected. Poroshenko, of course, was elected without the votes of any Russians in Donetsk or Luhansk.
Yeah, I mean, they were literally under the gun.
By that
they were under the gun. People shouldn't vote while they're under the gun, you know?
Yeah. But none of those people had the right to vote, essentially, in that situation. They were excluded from the voting process in that election. That was one of the reasons for the invasion.
And also because of what we discussed in the beginning of the program, they found out there was an abundance of lithium in those areas.
Yeah.
And so Kerensky's trying to get in those areas. He could be working with people like Zelensky. He could be working with people like Elon Musk on this. Elon Musk, we know now, was involved with the Bolivian coup to try to extract lithium from there. So
that would explain Zelensky's switch, because remember, he was elected.
He was the pro-peace candidate.
He was elected to make peace with Russia and to crack down on the Nazis. And instead, he made peace with the Nazis and cracked down on Russia.
Well, they laughed at him when he went to these, paramilitary, Nazi groups to tell them to disarm. They told him to get out of there. And they said, if you have a problem, we'll kill you. So Zelensky's a weak leader. He's probably considered by most of the Ukrainian Jews as a sellout. Again, the majority of the Ukrainian Jews consider themselves actually Russian Jews. They're in the south and the east of the country. Zelensky, he happens to be Jewish.
His whole reason for running was because he was a Russian
sellout, and his grandfather, unfortunately, his grandfather who's alive today probably be ashamed of him because his grandfather fought for the Red Army. So he had family that were heroes against fascism. But Zelensky instead has decided to be a puppet of the United States. Well, whatever the United States tells him to do, he does. We're going to go nuclear, he said.
Let's be fair.
They went to Chernobyl. The Russians, the first site they went to was the nuclear plant, because if they're threatening to become a NATO, have NATO bases in their country on the border with the history,
they don't want missiles
and
there.
They're going to go nuclear. How could Zelensky say that? He didn't have his own country's interests at heart if he would let the U.S. pressure him to say something.
Ever since the U.S. pulled out of the intermediate missile ban, the intermediate range ballistic missile ban, Russia's been scared of missiles in Ukraine.
Of course.
They've got missiles in Poland now. Missiles in Ukraine would be more accurate.
That's correct.
And that's what Russia really doesn't want. Now, I don't know of any concrete plans to put missiles in Ukraine, but if you're not in a treaty that bans intermediate weapons and you're building intermediate range weapons, eventually you're going to want to put some launch pads in Ukraine.
By the way, Zelensky can end the war in one day.
Yes.
All he has to do is say, we're going to leave Luhansk and Donetsk alone, and we're not going to enter NATO. But he won't do that. And by the way, there are several biolabs. Did you hear about these biolabs?
I did.
Nobody's talking about it in the so-called mainstream.
Well, the reason
there are U.S.-based biolabs that have the potential to kill thousands of people that are at risk.
So they're
going to use that to make chemical weapons, probably.
Let's be specific and correct, because the propaganda around this is all carefully built around not lying, but without actually telling the real truth.
Okay.
So when they say there are no U.S. bioweapons labs in the Ukraine,
okay,
that's technically true. Because what we're dealing with is what had been Soviet biolabs that became Ukrainian biolabs when the USSR broke up, just like what had been Soviet missile silos became Ukrainian missile silos when the Soviet Union broke up. You know, the nuclear weapons that the Ukrainians gave up.
Right.
So you have, and since they became Ukrainian, the U.S. has been paying the Ukrainians not to make bioweapons.
Really?
Yes, really. That's Victoria Nuland's testimony to the U.S. Senate.
Yeah, and they're saying now that she's a liar when she was the biggest backer of the coup. She was admitting the existence of these biolabs.
But so that's the thing is, again, they're very careful.
By the way, that's a federal crime, Chris. That's a federal crime. You can't lie to Congress.
They're very carefully technically telling the truth and lying by doing it. Because they're saying there are no U.S. bioweapons labs in Ukraine.
But you can say there's U.S. coordinated biolabs. These biolabs would not be in existence without these U.S. payments, right?
These U.S. payments are what keep the biolabs open without having to make and sell bioweapons to the highest bidder.
And also, you know, look at the Syrian rebels that had chemical weapons that they did false flags to make it look like Assad. Mm-hmm. You know, they probably had biolabs too. A lot of these chemical weapons throughout the world that these either rebels or regimes end up getting. I mean, there's U.S. fingerprints all over this.
Well, so again, who gave them to Saddam Hussein in the first place?
Right.
By
the way, Iran now, not just Pakistan, Chris. Iran is uniting with Russia. China's probably working with Russia now behind the scenes. There are things that Russia can do, and these sanctions are hurting average Russian people, by the way. They're not hurting the oligarchs. And why are they only saying the only oligarchs in the world are Russian, right? Elon Musk, who we mentioned earlier, he's an oligarch.
Yes,
Bill
he
Gates is an oligarch. Jeff Bezos. We have more oligarchs than anybody.
Elon Musk is the richest man in the world and a citizen of 3 countries.
Really? Let me guess. One of them's Israel.
No.
Okay, that's Bezos then.
Really close, though. Really close, though.
Really?
Elon Musk is from South Africa.
Okay.
His father is South African.
Okay.
He was born in South Africa. Okay. His mother is a Canadian supermodel. His mother is a Canadian supermodel who married his father, who owned emerald mines.
Wow.
Elon Musk
is self-made, right?
Elon Musk was given an emerald mine by his father that he used to raise money to invest. But he's not self-made. He's someone who used his father's emerald mine to finance his corporate rating.
You know, the white South African apartheid regime was getting support from Israel.
Yes.
His father was probably part of that. That's interesting. He has Canadian, South African, and American citizenship.
Yes. He has Canadian citizenship because of his mom and because he's rich, basically. Because Canada wouldn't have made him a citizen if he weren't rich.
Interesting. So he's a citizen there then.
He's a naturalized American citizen. I don't know. Canada decided he was a citizen. And of course, he was born in South Africa. So he's a triple citizen, which most people aren't, but because he's a billionaire, he can be.
I'm in the process of trying to acquire a Peruvian passport because my father's from there. For example, when I went to Venezuela last year as an American citizen, there is no diplomatic relations. Peru recently, with the new government, established diplomatic relations with Venezuela. But if I ever wanted to travel to sanctioned countries or countries that have diplomatic rupture with the United States, like Iran, as part of my journalism, or Venezuela, etc., it's easier to do it with a different passport logistically.
Peru elected the Popular Front guy.
Well, Pedro Castillo is a socialist.
Yes.
He has some moderates around him, but he comes from socialist origins. And I think he really does want to reconcile with Venezuela. He has to do it in a slow way because of the approving oligarchs, and then they might do the coup against him as a result.
That's the trouble. A socialist leader of a popular front has to move at the speed of his fastest liberals.
Probably Pedro Castillo is just as socialist as Allende was in Chile, but Allende had to make compromises with his coalition as well.
That was the same thing that the government that we threw out of Guatemala, Jacobo Arbenz, was doing.
Yes, Arbenz was at a progressive at least, and he wanted to nationalize United Fruit, who are now Chiquita Banana. Well, it's funny because the CEO of United Fruit at the time was the brother of Dulles, the director of the CIA, the same CIA who threw Arbenz from power. And guess who was in Guatemala when that happened? Che Guevara. Che Guevara was working as a doctor for Arbenz's government. And he witnessed the U.S.-backed coup. He had an opportunity to return to Argentina. He said, no, I'm going to continue the revolution to Mexico. And in Mexico, he met the Castro brothers, recently exiled, and the rest is history. But a lot of people don't know that what inspired or what helped inspire Che to become revolutionary was witnessing a U.S.-backed coup against a leader he admired in Guatemala. So that's important to understand. And actually, ironically, the Bay of Pigs operation was a CIA used CIA training grounds in Guatemala with the new regime there to send them back to Cuba to try to invade.
This is a total
side. There was a genocide against the Mayan people in Guatemala as a result as well.
Yeah, this is a total segue, but as an interesting fact, the number one CIA agent, not officer but agent, in charge of trying to kill Castro was Santos Traficante Jr., who was the mob's guy in Havana.
I know.
Under Batista.
I used to live in Tampa. I know all about Traficante. He was from Tampa. He was fluent in Italian and Spanish. He lived in the war. He grew up with Cubans from Tampa, but he actually was captured. He was the only American mobster in Havana that was captured by the guerrillas when they took over in '59.
And
I don't know how he convinced them to let him go.
I'll tell you how.
There's a lot of stories
for them. He was spying on the mafia for the Cubans. And when the CIA came in to say we want to kill Castro, Traficante was right there and said, "Hey, I'm your Cuban mob guy."
Yeah, but the thing is, they said that the mobsters took the money from the CIA and did nothing.
But that's
they actually warned Castro, some of them.
But that's what's so funny.
Because Traficante, I believe, was the one
was working for Castro.
Hold on. Wasn't Traficante the one that believed that he was promised by Fidel that he would be able to bring casinos back to Havana? Fidel was just playing him so he could get the intel from him, right?
But basically,
yeah, I heard about that.
But they let him go because he agreed to work for him.
Right, and he actually did.
The only reason he was spying for the Cubans.
I also heard that there was like money that the mob was hiding in Havana, and he told the guerrillas where they could find it because when Batista left, he stole so much money from the treasurer.
It's so funny because the CIA literally chose the guy who was working for Castro to be in charge of killing Castro, and you wonder why he's still alive
600 plus times, and so many times the Cuban intelligence found out
now
about it in advance. That's nothing. You have these leftists that believe that are very gullible. I'll give you an example. So the Venezuelan intelligence was trained by the Cuban intelligence.
Yes.
Who were trained by the Soviet intelligence.
Yes.
Do you think I would be the only American in the entire state of Florida invited by the United Socialist Party of Venezuela and have the access to the officials that I had access to last year? If I was what they claim, because a lot of these people, they think that I'm a agent provocateur or something. It's like they had to do a thorough background check on me before they officially invited me down there, and that's why it's important to know history, because you have to know that Venezuelan intelligence checked me out, and these are the same ones that were trained by the Cubans that were trained by the Soviets. But we need to stop believing lies about one another and know our history and unite for different causes. That could be the liberation of Alex Saab, of Julian Assange, the end of hostilities in Ukraine, a lasting peace, right? Yes. Because for there to be a lasting peace in Ukraine, you have to recognize all this history and deal with the neo-Nazi problem and deal with the NATO encroachment on the frontiers of Russia.
You have to be willing to understand that because And this is where people get confused. It's not a Nazi state. There are only like so many Nazis.
10% or whatever. Yeah.
Well, it doesn't matter whether it's a quote unquote Nazi state or not, if they think Nazis are good and normal. And that's really the difference.
Oh, yeah, I was going to say that earlier. There are people on CNN now that are saying things like, well, Putin's worse than Hitler. So they're not only being Hitler apologists, they're fine with giving carte blanche to these neo-Nazi groups to continue their atrocities.
That's the whole thing. You have to make that kind of argument. If you're justifying supporting Nazis to fight the Russians, Putin has to be worse than Hitler to justify supporting Nazis. The two go together.
Remember what I posted the other day about identity politics? That also has a role here. The EU was actually reluctant. Wasn't it Victoria Nuland who got caught in a phone conversation saying "fuck the EU" back in 2014?
Yes.
So they were reluctant for a while to back the coup because they were concerned about these neo-Nazi groups.
And that's the whole thing.
And what changed their mind? When the U.S. did everything possible to make sure Zelensky could win, knowing he was going to be a sellout. And they could say, how could they be a Nazi state if they have a Jew there? He's a sellout.
You know what changed their mind more than anything else?
Besides identity politics?
Trump. Trump trying to wreck NATO.
Trump actually sent more weapons to Ukraine than Obama did.
Well, I know, but listen to this, because Trump went on with the pro-Putin.
Right.
And you remember all that Russiagate stuff.
And the Europeans did not like Trump because he exposed NATO and all that stuff.
Well, that's the whole thing.
He made them look stupid when it came to NATO.
Their security blanket was going to go away. And to a lot of Europeans, NATO is why they can deal with Russians on equal footing. But it's also why they're more dependent on the U.S. than Russia.
Isn't Germany, out of all the EU, the most kind of neutral on this? And that's because they rely so much on Russian oil. Germany was tied with Russia in lots of ways, but they gave up their pipeline. It's called the Nord Stream pipeline, right? The Russian pipeline is obsolete now in the West.
A joint German-Russian project. It was owned by the Germans, but it was built to bring Russian natural gas via Gazprom to Germany.
By the way, the only sustainable solution is to go wind and solar, renewable energy.
That's the only way.
Electronic cars and lithium, but you got to go renewable. You don't rely on anybody's oil, Saudi or Venezuelan or whoever,
or even American oil.
Yeah, because we're also exploiting our own environment.
We're the number one
pipelines, but
we're the number one fossil fuel exporter in the world. That's not all production. It's also the fact that we take in oil from other countries and refine it and then export it elsewhere.
Yeah, we have the supplies to make refinery factories. For example, it's true that Venezuela has the number one oil supply in the world, but it's crude oil. It's not refined. Yes. It's hard for them to get in their factories the equipment they need.
The only place they can, for a while, the only place they were able to get their oil refined was Cuba because of.
Yeah, Chavez made a deal with Cuba where they sent a lot of oil, and then Cuba had the supplies to refine. By the way, Cuba built like 3 new COVID vaccines in spite of the embargo continuing on during the pandemic, and also during what's called the special period when the Soviet Union fell and Cuba lost all that support. At that time in the 90s in Cuba, they invented what we don't have access to, a lung cancer vaccine. Yep. So Cuba right now has a higher life expectancy than us, and the people love cigars there. I was there. How do they live so long and not get lung cancer? They have this vaccine, and the embargo, it hurts us because we have people dying from lung cancer that could be saved if we took in the Cuban technology, and it's all because we don't like how their government runs things.
There were people during the window where tourism was easier because of Obama. Mm. There were people who are going from Florida to Cuba for their cancer treatments.
No, I know. So they would have
to. And when the embargo came back, boom, they had to stop.
Yeah, I mean, it's technically still a little lighter, but Biden has kept up a lot of the strict measures that Trump had. Actually made new ones against Nicaragua for them voting away that the U.S. didn't like. And I believe the Squad, I'm still trying to look up the who voted how, but I believe the Squad even went along with the sanctions against Nicaragua. So it's, All right, sir. So yeah, that's just shows the hypocrisy.
Yeah, and I want to wrap up real quick, but I want to what matters about the anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations more than anything else is that it kept these connections alive between people in Ukraine, especially the Ukrainian People's Movement, which was the first legal political party opposing the communists after the in any of the other republics after during Perestroika, and because the People's Movement was very closely linked to some of the people who would later become the new round of Ukrainian Nazis. In the 1980s, a Ukrainian American named Ivan Zalawi was working for the Heritage Foundation. So, American Nazis, right? So while he was working for the Heritage Foundation, a Ukrainian from the People's Movement was giving a speech at the Heritage Foundation, and he joined the Ukrainian People's Movement. And then in 1991, Zalawi went back to Ukraine and became a Ukrainian citizen and became active in Ukrainian business and politics, and runs a consulting firm that helps foreign businesses do business in Ukraine. He also does ride-alongs with the Idar Battalion when they go on pogroms. And he's been
the Azov Battalion.
Idar is the other Nazi battalion.
Oh yeah, there's plenty of them.
Yeah, but between the Idar was the other one that was formed before they were integrated into the National Guard. Right. But he's gone on ride-alongs with the Idar Battalion. And
by the way, did you hear about reports of the organizers of Unite the Right that killed Heather, ultimately resulted in the death of Heather Heyer, having gone to Ukraine to be trained by some of these groups?
Some of them absolutely have. Adam Laughlin sends people to Ukraine to fight the Russians and to get paramilitary training that they can use when they come back here. And that's the thing that scares me the most is they talk about there being 33,000 Nazi paramilitaries in Ukraine now from all over the world.
And there's even academic sources that I went over that showed how some of these trainings have gone. It's not just RT, you know what I mean? It's like, even academic sources have acknowledged that this is going on, and it's having an effect on how our alt-right groups, operate.
The real question is how many of the Canadian Nazis in the trucker attack on Ottawa?
Yeah.
How many of the January 6th attackers? How many of these folks have been to Ukraine?
Yeah. I mean, they talk about, homegrown terrorists that are inspired. So I look videos of, Islamists online, but here are people actually going and physically getting trained by these people, inspired by them to do these.
Here's the thought. Yeah. Here's the thought I want to leave you with, and everyone listening to us. The Nazis are supported by the U.S. to fight the Russians. We build up ISIS to do our dirty work in Syria, to destabilize the country, and to make it possible to overthrow Assad, to inconvenience the Russians. It didn't work, but it created this ISIS network all over the world doing all sorts of stuff, for us or not. Imagine a Nazi ISIS in Ukraine, and imagine that it lasts as long as the original ISIS lasted. Does that scare you yet? ISIS was bad enough. Imagine a Nazi ISIS in Ukraine for the next 10, 15 years.
And plus, Assad was the ruling government there. And obviously, he was fighting ISIS and had help from Russians and others in doing that. Here we have Zelensky unable or unwilling to control his own people in the government that are continuing these extremist acts.
The thing that you have to remember, You know why they can't control the Nazis? Because the Nazis have had that relationship with the U.S. government since 1946, and the Ukrainian state isn't that old. The
You're
U.S.
talking about
ally,
the OSS, right? The OSS that existed prior to the CIA. They
the
probably also worked with
U.S. the U.S. ally in Ukraine is the Nazis. That's
people
who
should
we're
realize that.
supporting more than the government. They started the war. There's a video that everybody can find on Twitter if they look hard enough, where one of their leaders is bragging about having started the war, about having made
And
Russia
they're trying to
invade.
draw Belarus into it now. Belarus just stopped a missile sent from Ukraine to hit their territory.
Yeah,
And if a Russian or a Belarusian missile hits Poland or any NATO country, this could spark it to World War
one
III.
of
It doesn't even have to be U.S. forces going into Ukraine. If a missile accidentally or somehow hits a NATO nation, we'll be in World War III. That's how bad it's gotten.
remember,
And all the people that have been so passive in ignoring foreign policy and ignoring our cries of look what they're doing to Eastern Ukraine, now they all want to pretend to be experts. This is what pisses me off: hypocrisy, right?
yeah,
Because now these people, most of them, can't find Ukraine on the map. They want to say that, oh, look what Putin's doing. It's like you should have looked at what the fascists were doing in Ukraine years ago. They helped set the conditions for this to go on. You and I are against war. We don't support the intervention. Putin's clearly overreacted. But at the same time, if you're provoking, the Russian bear, if you're provoking a state, it's going to have to respond if nothing's done about it.
So let's assume everybody's a rational actor, because it's not hard. You look at what the U.S. has been doing in Ukraine, and you look at who's been targeted, and you look at how that has affected Russia. And the only thing that can be done is for either it to be settled peacefully or for Russia to go to war. I mean, rationally, those are the only options states have: make peace or go to war. If you can't settle something through diplomacy, you try to settle it yourself. The people of Donetsk and Luhansk made 3 agreements with the Ukrainian government in which they were guaranteed autonomy and peace, and the Ukrainian government promised to enforce the Nazi side of the agreement, not to attack them. So all 3 of those agreements have been violated by Nazis attacking.
And the last one was in Minsk in Belarus, and they haven't respected it at all.
No. Well, the Nazis haven't respected it, and the Ukrainian state can't control the Nazis, like you said.
So even if the Nazis were 10% of the armed forces, only 10%, that 10% is backed by the U.S., and there's a lack of political will on Zelensky and his partners' part for them to deal with them. So it is a significant threat.
By a comparison, only about 10% of the German party were card-carrying Nazis when Hitler took power. 10% of the German people.
Yeah, they had a parliamentary system.
The most. And Hitler didn't win in parliament. He got the most. He had the most number of votes, but he had actually lost votes to Hindenburg's party and the communists in the last election just before he became chancellor.
In 32,
he still had the biggest party. But if Thalmann and the Social Democrats had been able to form a popular front at that time, Hitler never would have been chancellor.
Good point.
The reason that it didn't happen was because there was just too much history there. There was no way the German communists could possibly trust the Social Democrats.
Who was calling for them to unite at that time was Trotsky.
Yeah,
he was against Stalin's position on that.
Yes.
And Trotsky knew Rosa Luxemburg. It's not like he thought that when the Social Democrats had crushed Linebeck and Luxemburg that there was anything good about him.
True.
But he understood it had been several years since then. And for political pragmatism, to prevent the rise of the Nazis, they needed to do that. Trotsky was not listened to. And Trotsky wouldn't have called it Popular Front, but still, he wanted them to unite for that. He didn't get listened to.
It was the United Front.
Right, that's correct. We mentioned that earlier. So, but yeah, thanks for having me co-host with you this important topic tonight. And I hope we can continue to do shows, bro. Maybe even the 2 of us could interview somebody
Well, we can talk about that, and we can definitely plan for that. I know you had some people you wanted to talk to, and
Maybe
I
we
can
could even try to get Lee Camp on. I'll try to reach out to him again. I have his email.
sounds
Uh,
well, he's a mutual of mine on Twitter.
yep, yep. So people that have been censored, I feel it's our responsibility as fellow journalists to let their voices be heard.
Yeah. Now I should
Um,
probably reach out to Lee.
yeah, and
Uh,
even maybe even Ben Norton.
yeah.
Ben Norton's an interesting character. Like all these
Lots of
independent
great.
journals, we should all try to work together.
Well, next week I have something I'm trying to put together. I think everybody will like it, and so I have specific plans. But we should definitely touch base to talk to somebody specifically together. Yes, and so we'll work on that. And
I'd
folks,
have to grow my hair so I can match you and Lee, right? Because you guys both got long hair. And Lee is literally a comedian, so he'd probably like my me wearing a Russian hat at the beginning of the show, like I did this time.
probably.
Oh, I didn't tell you when I met Lee the second time. Last time I was in DC, a couple months before COVID. He walked into the bar after his show because he'd like to have drinks with the people that were watching his show, and he was signing the receipt. And I said, "Hey, look, he's giving an autograph." And he laughed and he said, "Nice joke." And I took it like I was so flattered because here we are, a professional comedian for years,
Yeah,
besides being a political journalist. Thank me for my joke. I thought it was just some stupid joke. And he laughed and he said, "That's a good one."
that's good.
But yeah, he's
And
very down to earth, good guy, courageous. It's terrible he's being censored. I hope he can still have his voice heard.
I hope so too. And I want to help with that. I want to thank everybody who joined us tonight. I really appreciate it. It's my first show back, so thank you very much. Next week, I hope to have some people on from who have some people who have left the movement for a People's Party. They want to talk a little bit about some of the stuff that some of you may have heard going on other shows more recently with people who are still with the People's Party talking. I
I
want to
was
try to
with
give
him. I was with him for a few months too, back in the day.
I want to give some people on the other side a chance to have their say. And so that's what we have to look forward to next week, folks. Alex, I want to have you back soon. Um, Everybody, thanks for joining us. You all have a good night. We'll tweet at you.